We went through these exercises every day in the training area, just going through the motions without live ammunition. The horse handlers, fahrers, and the gunners, cannoneers, exercised constantly but separately. A gun crew consisted of one gun leader, an Unteroffizier or Unterwachtmeister, 5 cannoneers, and 3 fahrers. The direction gunner was the key cannoneer because he handled the sighting and the aiming of the gun. The others handled ammunition, loaded the gun, and helped camouflage the gun with branches. After a couple of weeks of the cannoneers and fahrers practicing separately, we came together for the first time. From then on, fahrers and cannoneers practiced together daily, and once a week all 4 gun crews would come together and practice as a battery. Christmas was approaching, and we began looking forward to a break in our training routine. Half of us were to get 5 days of furlough at Christmas, and the other half were to get 5 days at New Year's. Rausche, Wohithat, and Bersel drew Christmas furlough, and Weinreich, Vogel, and I received our furloughs at New Year's. When the first group left, just before Christmas, everything seemed suddenly very strange, because our total regimentation had been broken. We had to police the area and keep everything spick and span, but most of our routine training was discontinued until after New Year's, and we had free time to lie around and be lazy. Most of the higher-ranking non-commissioned officers had managed Christmas furloughs, leaving mostly Stabsgefreiters in charge. Stabsgefreiters were a unique group in the German army, because this was a rank reserved for losers, career soldiers who could not handle responsibility and would never hold a rank higher than Stabsgefreiter. Christmas furlough was an opportunity for them to exercise authority, however, and they took full advantage of it. The Stabsgefreiter in charge of us in Kral's absence was Weizsäcker, and we were more than a little apprehensive about him. He seemed to be a very sadistic sort who liked to throw his weight around when he had a rare opportunity. Since Weinreich and I were intellectuals, we knew we would be in trouble if we ever found ourselves at his mercy. Weinreich and I drew stable duty on Christmas Eve. At least we were trusted with pitchforks by now. Stable duty consisted of cleaning the stalls and sorting out the straw. The straw could not be too dirty, so new straw had to be placed on top of the old straw. The underneath mattress of old straw would already be pressed down, and the new straw would be placed on top of that, so the horse would not get dirty when it lay down. The stable had a cement floor, and we had to learn how much straw to take out and how much to leave. About every 3 weeks, all the straw would be removed, the cement floor would be cleaned with water, and all new straw would be put down. An immense amount of new straw was needed to make the required mattress. After enduring the odour of removing the old straw, we found the fresh scent of new straw an unforgettable pleasure. Weinreich and I drew the unenviable duty of removing all the soiled straw from a section of the stall and washing down the cement floor. We had hardly begun when Stabsgefreiter Weizsäcker came marching Vogel into the barn, shouting at him about extra duty. Weinreich and I stopped our work and looked around to see what was happening. The moment we stood up, Weizsäcker pounced on us. "Aha! The intellectuals are loafing!" he shouted gleefully, momentarily forgetting about Vogel. "Well, if you have so much free time, I have a perfect solution especially designed for intellectuals and smart mouths." He grinned at Vogel. Weizsäcker motioned for Vogel to get into the stall with Weinreich and me. "Now, let's see you guys clean this place out with your hands." Our expressions must have reflected our shock, because he grinned even wider. "That's right," he said. "Hang up your pitchforks." Vogel started to protest, but quickly thought better of it. Weizsäcker's half-moon grin was topped by a round, bulbous nose and small, close-set eyes. He was obviously enjoying his rare experience with authority. "I will be back in 30 minutes, he said, "and this stall had better be empty and spotless." He turned and strutted importantly toward the door. Vogel picked up a tiny piece of horse manure and flipped it at the departing Weizsäcker, who fortunately never saw the defiant gesture. We began picking up large sections of packed straw with bare hands, trying unsuccessfully to avoid the overpowering stench of horse urine that arose as the straw was removed, and carrying it to the wheelbarrows. With nearly superhuman effort, we had our part of the stall completely cleaned and washed down when Weissacker returned 30 minutes later. He came stalking into the stable, looking smug and self-important, like the Italian dictator Mussolini in newsreels I had seen. When he saw the empty stall, his face fell. He clearly had thought it would be impossible for us to do the job in 30 minutes and was looking forward to imposing more extra duty on us. He seemed confused upon finding that he had no excuse for further punishment. "It is a damn good thing," he muttered as a way to save face, and stalked out of the stable. It was not exactly an ideal Christmas Eve, but we survived it, and actually in fairly good spirits once the filthy task in the stable was finished. 5 days at the mercy of the Stabsgefreiters left me more than ready for my own furlough. Being home again was very pleasant, however brief. The total lack of regimentation seemed unnatural and strange at first. Having my mother hovering to serve my every wish made me feel that I must be in another world, a dream world. My father was interested in comparing my experience to his experience in the Navy 20 years earlier. Fritz, of course, was fascinated with both sets of stories and sat at our feet as we related them. Inga was friendlier than I could ever remember her being before, but still reserved. Grandma came to visit, of course, and to brag about her handsome young soldier grandchild. My father had got out of the wholesale grocery business and was now operating a restaurant and nightclub. I found Liebelt, Michaelis, and Ebert, and learned from them that Friedrich was also home on furlough. I was delighted that we could all get together for an evening before Friedrich had to return to Dresden, where he was in training to become an officer. Of course, since he was a Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier and I was but a lowly cannoneer, he strutted about, playfully shouting orders at me. "We should plan another ski trip to the Sudeten Mountains when Knappe and Friedrich get out of the army," Liebelt suggested. "I wonder if old Herr Hofer would still be there," Friedrich said. "I don't know if I will still be in Germany," Michaelis said gloomily. "My father is talking seriously about moving to England. He does not trust the Nazis because we are Jewish." "God, I hope you're still here," Ebert said. "It wouldn't be the same without you." "Let's toast the 5 of us, just in case," Michaelis suggested, raising his glass of wine. "To us and to the future." We all drank to Michaelis's toast. Following the wonderfully non-regimented furlough, we quickly fell back into the old routine of training. Actually, the routine felt good to me. Our whole first year was intensive basic training, with manoeuvres in the field once a month. Practice sessions would include pulling the guns, first on the road and then cross-country, and getting into position. The battery commander, a Hauptmann, would select the battery position for the guns, and the lieutenants would get the people into place, select the individual positions for the 4 guns, and camouflage the guns. A team of horses strains under the weight of a heavy artillery piece. In late January 1937, Weinreich and I were selected for training in communications because of our gymnasium education. The battery troop, which was always up front with the infantry, and the gun crews communicated by both wireless radio and telephone. This required a radio operator and a telephone operator up front with the battery troop, and another of each back with the guns. Wireless radio was cutting-edge technology in 1937, and I was very proud to become a radio operator, even if it was in the horse-drawn artillery. My training as a communications man also included measuring angles, estimating distances, and all the things the forward observation officer had to know so that I could do his job if he was killed or badly wounded. Fairly often in combat, the communications man would have to assume these duties, and we practiced this constantly. Now that I was a communications specialist, I had to learn how to ride a horse. As a city dweller, I had to get accustomed to handling these huge animals, but it did not take long. We had to learn to brush and feed the horses, each of us had 2 to look after, and to saddle them. We had riding lessons an hour a day for about 10 weeks, under the tutelage of Obergefreiter Sebastian. It was winter, so we would lead our horses into the covered riding arena. The riding class was 10 to 12 riders, and most of us were new and inexperienced with horses. Leading our horses, we would march into the riding arena and learn how to stand the right distance from each other in a straight line in the middle of the arena. Then we learned how to mount a horse, how to hold the reins, and what to do and not do. In the summer, the battalion, all 3 batteries, came together for the first time, and in late summer we worked together with the infantry for the first time. For this, we had to leave Jena, our garrison town, and go to a military reservation at Jüterbog near Berlin, where we could fire live ammunition. Working with the infantry was the highlight of our training. We seldom practiced with the infantry in garrison because of limited space, with the farms all around. We could practice in the fall after the crops were in, but even then a lot of damage was done and the farmers did not like it. We had to take the farmers' fences down and then put them up again. We had to be very careful with the fences, which was time-consuming and difficult. We marched from Jena to Jüterbog. We were roused out of bed at 4:30 a.m. and had an hour to feed and water the horses and have our own breakfast. Then we hitched the teams to the guns and wagons and moved out. The infantry led the way, with the artillery following. The infantry marched on foot, and we in the artillery either rode on horseback or rode on the guns or wagons. The guns were pulled backward, with their barrels pointing behind us. The battery commander led the 8th Battery on horseback, followed by the forward observation officer with the battery troop. Then came the battery officer with the 4-gun crews and the ammunition and supply wagons. Suddenly we received word that the infantry in front of us had encountered resistance, and we were to deploy and support the infantry. The battery commander and the forward observation officer with the battery troop moved up to join the infantry. After being advised of the infantry battle plan, the battery commander rode back to instruct the battery officer and determine the gun positions, designating the exact spot for each of the 4 guns. The guns were unhitched and positioned by hand by the cannoneers. The ammunition was unloaded from the limbers, which the Fahrers then took back to cover, where they dismounted and cared for their horses. The battery officer selected a reference point that could be seen from the gun position. The forward observation officer selected a target for sighting purposes and gave directions to the battery officer, as well as the position of his reference point, who then gave orders to the gun crew of gun number 2, which did the initial sighting for all 4 guns. After each round, the forward observation officer called back adjustments. When gun number 2 was zeroed in, all the guns fired on the target, live ammunition for the first time, and the roar of the guns was deafening. When we received word that the enemy resistance had been broken, the Fahrers rode back to the gun positions and hitched the horses to the guns. We communications people restored our equipment to their containers and remounted them on our horses. We then resumed our cross-country march, but we were all flushed and excited from actually going through the whole coordinated action and firing live ammunition for the first time. We were considerably less disciplined than we had been before, but only for a short while. We were soon back in our disciplined routine. While we were at Jüterbog, Hitler ordered a big parade for the benefit of Mussolini, who was visiting Germany and whom Hitler wanted to impress with German military might. I think this was one of the few times when a whole division went on parade. As participants, unfortunately, all we saw was dust, with an artillery regiment of 4 battalions totalling 48 cannons, each pulled by a team of 6 galloping horses. Nearly 300 horses and 100 cannon wheels raised so much dust that not only could we not see, we could barely breathe. On the weekends back at Jena, we could get a pass to go to town unless we had stable or guard duty. Weinreich and I had become good friends and usually went to town together. As in labour service, my weekend passes were usually spent in a combination of cultural pursuits and meeting girls and dancing. One day in the spring of 1937, I was instructed to report to Lieutenant Badstubner's office. This was my first personal contact with an officer. I reported to him in his office as ordered, and he cordially invited me to take a seat. I understand that you plan to attend university after your army service, he said. Jawohl, Herr Leutnant, I replied. What would you think about attending a military officer? He asked. In academy and becoming a reserve stead of 2 years, you would have to serve 3. But then you would have no reserve duty obligations and would be completely free to attend university and study. That sounded logical to me, and I was enjoying army life, so why not? Jawohl, Herr Leutnant, I replied. I would like that. Weinreich and 2 other gymnasium grad also been invited to become officer candidates, so we now had additional training, as well as some duties of non-commissioned officers. Lieutenant Badstubner was responsible for our training and special duties. He was only a couple of years older than we were, and not long out of the military academy himself. Our military training was now stepped up. Normally, our second year in the army would have been a repetition of our first, except that in the second year we would have taken over some supervisory duties. But because we were in officer training, we began learning military tactics. We began to learn the observation officers' and battery officers' jobs. We were put into command positions to learn leadership and how to use our voices to command troops. In training new troops, we did the same job as the non-commissioned officers. Some of the non-commissioned officers were friendly, but some of them resented us because they were older and they knew that 1 year later we would be lieutenants and they would still be non-commissioned officers 5 years from now. There were 4 ranks for officer candidates. The ranks were Fahnenjunker Gefreiter, equivalent to Gefreiter, and Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier, equivalent to Unteroffizier, before we went to the academy. Halfway through the military academy, we would become Fähnrich, and at graduation from the academy, we would be promoted to Oberfähnrich, which was almost an officer. On June 1st, as an officer candidate, I became a Fahnenjunker Gefreiter. I would otherwise have qualified for Gefreiter rank only after 1 year. Stabsgefreiter Weizsäcker was bitter at the thought of a first-year recruit suddenly almost equalling him in rank, and he knew that I would outrank him in a few months. He, of course, would never be more than a Stabsgefreiter regardless how long he stayed in the army. I could sympathise with him, but he was still a little hard to take at times. The Fahnenjunker Gefreiters stayed in the same barracks, and we did the same things as the others, except that on certain days, at certain times, we came together and had special training. The special training made our lives more interesting. Those of us in officer candidate training also had increasingly more contact with the officer corps. They had regular social events, to which we were occasionally invited. The dances were attended by daughters of the older officers and by local business and professional people and their daughters. The dances and social events provided us with excellent opportunities to develop and practice our social skills. We went out with the other enlisted men to help the farmers with their harvest during the latter half of July 1937. It was fun, it was a nice break in routine for us, and it was a great help for the farmers. Of course, we were all accustomed to working with horses, and many of the soldiers were accustomed to farm work. We sang as we went to work in the fields, and we thoroughly enjoyed helping the farmers out. They were very appreciative, and they fed us extremely well. On September 1st, 1937, I was promoted to Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier. On October 1st, after 1 full year in the army, I received a 10-day furlough before reporting to the military academy in Potsdam. Weinreich and I were both assigned to Kriegsschule Potsdam near Berlin. Arrived at Kriegsschule Potsdam in mid-October 1937, looking forward to an exciting new experience. I took a train to Potsdam, a relatively small town near Berlin, and then caught a bus to the school, arriving in late afternoon. Kriegsschule Potsdam was a very large and modern complex, surrounded by a wrought-iron fence on a concrete base. The whole complex looked very military and official. A Gefreiter at the gate inspected my orders and directed me to the administration building. There, a clerk directed me to room 17C, where I found a lieutenant seated at a wooden desk. "I am Lieutenant Breker," he said. "Welcome to Kriegsschule Potsdam. I am going to be your platoon leader while you are here." He sat back down at the desk, opened a folder, and began to look through some papers as I stood before the desk. A photograph of Chancellor Hitler adorned the wall in back of the desk, along with a lithograph of General Feldmarschall von Blomberg, Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht. "You established quite a good record at Jena," the lieutenant commented finally. "I am sure you will do just as well here. You have been assigned to Barrack 3, Suite L. Your training will begin tomorrow morning." I crossed a parade ground to 4 barrack buildings, where I found Barrack 3 and Suite L, and learned that a suite consisted of a large study room with 4 desks and a large bedroom with 4 beds, 4 lockers, and 4 individual washing facilities. Weinreich greeted me at Suite L, a big smile on his face. "Welcome to the manor, Herr Knapper," he said. I looked at him with both surprise and suspicion. "Are we rooming together again?" I asked. "No, I asked the lieutenant if he would put us together," he said with a shrug and a palms-up gesture. He could not, because every suite must have people from different branches of the service. But I am in the suite next door. My other roommates arrived during the afternoon. One was an infantryman named Hans Bottler, another was a cavalryman named Gustav Hoffmann, and I don't remember the 4th one. Since we had no duties for the rest of the day, we all decided to explore the layout of Kriegsschule Potsdam. The parade ground was the centre of the whole complex. On one side of the parade ground were the 4 barrack buildings, and on the other side was the administration building. To one end of the parade ground was the mess hall, which included a lounge where students could have a drink. Behind the barracks were the training area and the stables. Immediately behind the administration building were 4 classroom buildings, and beyond them were an indoor swimming pool, a large gym, and several tennis courts. Overall, the place was quite impressive, with its manicured grounds and neat new brick buildings. After breakfast the next morning, we were all called to an assembly, where we were greeted by the commander of Kriegsschule Potsdam, Oberst Wetzel. We learned that we were but one of 4 Kriegsschules, and that the others were at Munich, Hanover, and Dresden. Anyone who became an officer at that time had to graduate from one of them. Each had approximately 1,000 students. We were then divided into 2 groups of 500 each, labelled Group A and Group B. Suite L was assigned to Group B. Each group was commanded by an Oberstleutnant, Group A by Oberstleutnant Johannes Friesner, and Group B by Oberstleutnant Erwin Rommel. Rommel's name meant nothing to us then, but we would soon learn that he had been quite a hero in the World War, and that even today, at the age of 45, he was something of a celebrity in the German army. His feats of bravery and effectiveness in combat were astounding. We learned that he had received the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest decoration, during the World War as an Oberleutnant in the Alpine Corps on the Italian front. He had been a brilliant tactician even then. He had just this year, 1937, published a book on tactics called Infantry Attacks, which we were to use as a textbook. Once a week we were to have an assembly of both groups, at which Rommel would teach tactics. Within each group were 16 platoons of 32 men each. Each platoon was commanded by a major, who was assisted by a lieutenant. After the commander's presentation, Rommel was introduced and gave a little speech about the importance of a strong officer corps and what an honour it was for us to be selected to become officers in the German army. We were then separated into platoons and introduced to our platoon commanders. Mine was Major Kasnitz, a man of about 40, with thinning hair that was already turning grey. We got another short speech from him. He told us that at the academy we would be taught to lead an infantry battalion in combat. We would all be treated as infantry, even though many of us were in the artillery, the cavalry, and the panzers, tanks. Our training began immediately and continued without let-up until Christmas. We studied only military subjects because we were all gymnasium graduates who had just completed 13 years of intensive academic studies. Our major subject was tactics, and we spent most of our time on it. Other subjects included topography and reading maps, engineering, mostly building and blowing up bridges, basic artillery, horseback riding, drilling on the parade ground with rifles, cooperation with the Luftwaffe, and physical education. We spent 6 hours each day in the classroom and 3 hours in the field. We learned everything an infantry battalion commander had to know in any kind of pre-combat or combat situation. At the end of our training, we would theoretically be able to command an infantry battalion in combat. Every week we would have a test that was graded, very much as in gymnasium. We were not normally assigned homework during the week. In the evening we would look over what we had studied during the day and go over it again, so the next day we would be better acquainted with what had been discussed. We got homework every second or third weekend. In an attempt to put us under stress, similar to a combat situation, they gave us very little time to do the assignment. They would give us a situation in which we were a battalion commander. Our battalion was given a certain goal for the day, and we were marching to meet that goal. Suddenly, we would receive a message that the enemy had been spotted. Then we might get a contradictory message. Then we would encounter something else that would alter the situation. The problem was written out, and we would read it as if we were seeing it. From all the information given to us, we had to make our decision. 3 or 4 possibilities might be equally correct. We had to judge the situation and make a decision based on what we knew. We had to write the orders we would give to implement that decision. We had to explain why we made the decision. It was not so much that we had to make a patent decision as how we came to it, how we defended it, and how we executed it. We would go out into the field and play battalion commander. One person would be designated as the battalion commander, and the others would make up his staff. The staff would include an adjutant, an executive assistant to the commander, principally for administrative duties, 3 company commanders, a communications officer, and so on. An assault had to be prepared and orders issued. Major Kasnitz would make the assignments and distribute the rules for playing. Then he would keep notes on how well everyone handled himself. Sometimes the school commander, Oberst Wetzel, would also observe. After the exercise in the field, we would go back to the academy in a bus. Often the most warlike action of the day was the run toward the bus to get one of the better seats. In tactics, we studied how to attack, how to retreat, how to march, and so on. We studied military history, mostly Prussian battles from the 17th and 18th centuries, and battles from the Great World War. We studied how tactics and strategy were used in the battles. Often our 3 hours a day in the field would be infantry practice, for which we would wear our field uniforms, steel helmets, and gas masks. We would march about 20 minutes from the academy, with machine guns and the ammunition for them. We would march and then deploy. We marched 3 abreast. Then, when we came under fire, 1 person went left, 1 went right, and 1 went straight down. We would practice attacking, defending, retreating, and so on. We did this to make sure that everyone knew infantry tactics, even if he was in the artillery or panzers, because tactics usually determined the outcome of a battle. We also did some basic infantry training, like target shooting, firing machine guns, throwing hand grenades, and so on. Sometimes in engineering, we would go out and lay barbed wire and put up anti-tank obstacles. We learned where to apply dynamite to a bridge so it would collapse and not remain usable. We also studied how to deal with mines. We studied all these things both in the classroom and in the field. We had to take riding lessons also, even those of us in the cavalry and artillery who already knew how to ride. Our lives were quite pleasant at Kriegsschule Potsdam. We could study in our room, which was equipped with 4 desks and chairs. The mess hall was not much different from the soldiers' mess at Jena, a large hall with tables for 10 or 12 people each. The mess hall was used only for the noon meal. We were issued a 2-pound loaf of Kommissbrot, or army bread, every other day, which we kept in a special food compartment of our lockers. For breakfast, we would have Kommissbrot, butter, jam, and coffee. Somebody had to go to the mess hall every morning and get the butter, jam, and coffee and bring them back to the suite. For our evening meal, someone would also go to the mess hall to get butter and either liverwurst or cheese to go with our Kommissbrot, and we would also eat this in our suite. We had a lounge adjoining the mess hall where we could go at night and on the weekends and have a drink if we had the time. We could order beer, wine, cognac, or any other kind of drink. On rare occasions, someone would get drunk, but learning to drink socially without getting drunk was part of the training. An army officer who could not hold his liquor would present a bad image. Sometimes we drank a lot if we had something to celebrate, but almost everyone knew how to handle it. As students, we sometimes made excursions away from Potsdam. Major Kasnitz would go with us on these trips because he had to observe us in all kinds of different environments. Some of the excursions were for skiing, a skill considered necessary for winter combat, and others were to visit different battlefields. We made one early trip to East Prussia that lasted 2 weeks. On one trip, we spent a week skiing in the Sudeten Mountains, and I thought often of my trip with Michaelis, Liebeit, Ebert, and Friedrich. At each battlefield, we would study the campaign, and then go and tour the battlefield to get a feel for how these battles were fought: flank attacks, retreats, defence, counter-attacks. We would study the battle in the classroom, and then when we visited the battlefield, one of us would be designated to explain the battle. Then Major Kasnitz would criticise our explanation of the battle. It would be an all-day affair. On the way to a battlefield, we might visit a castle or a fortress. The excursions gave us some historical insights in addition to military insights. We studied the tactics of Alexander and Caesar, the Battle of Hastings, and Roman and Greek battles. We learned why things went right and why things went wrong. Sports were an important part of academy life. Tennis courts were available if we cared to play. Some sports were required, such as swimming, high diving, boxing, fencing, and horseback riding. In addition to enhancing physical fitness, the sports were intended to test our courage and make us competitive. I started training for the modern pentathlon, which consisted of fencing, pistol shooting, horseback riding, 10-kilometre cross-country running, and a 1,000-metre swim. Every day for some time, I ran 10 kilometres and swam 1,000 metres before going to bed. It was terrific training. Others played tennis and swam, and some just went to the lounge and had a drink. Sometimes on the weekends, when we did not have homework, we rented horses and went sightseeing. Potsdam was both colourful and historic, and these excursions were always interesting. Social affairs were arranged so we could practice our social graces and be observed and evaluated. We often had dances to which daughters of the older officers were invited. Anyone who had not learned how to dance properly had to learn now. There were dance schools in Potsdam for those who needed them. The dances were held in a large ballroom with live orchestras. Many of the officers at the Kriegsschule and their wives attended these dances. They were quite formal. The men wore dress uniforms and the women wore ball gowns. There were perhaps 4 dances during the 9 months I was at Potsdam. Major Kasnitz was always watching and evaluating us. His wife and his 2 teenage daughters also attended the dances. At one of the dances, all the 32 men in my platoon were introduced to Rommel's wife. We had to kiss her hand properly and exchange a few words. At Christmas, we got a furlough to go home. Liebeit, Michaelis, and Ebert were, of course, still at the university, and Friedrich was now a lieutenant. Of course, he lorded it over me even more now that he was a full-fledged officer, and I was the Fähnrich. I was beginning to wonder if our relationship would remain this way for the rest of our lives. Shortly before graduation, I was ordered to report to Major Kasnitz's office. When I reported, he returned my salute with a smile and invited me to have a seat. Knappe, in the combined military academies, approximately 4,000 new officers will graduate next week, he said. Jawohl, I said, a bit perplexed. Of those 4,000, your grades place you 24th from the top, he continued. That is no small achievement, and you are to be congratulated. Thank you, Herr Major, I said. But in addition to your grades, your athletic achievements and your demonstrated leadership ability led me to submit your name as a candidate for the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's Award for Outstanding Achievement, he went on. He then stood and extended his hand across his desk. "I am proud indeed to inform you that you have won that prestigious award," he said. "Congratulations." I was dumbfounded, but extremely proud and pleased. "Thank you, Herr Major," I said, shaking his hand. "I am very flattered. I had no idea that you had submitted my name." I titled my photograph album from Potsdam, "Sunny Time at Potsdam." I had really enjoyed the experience. The school had been hard work and it was challenging, but it was also great fun. We all had a lot in common. We were sports-minded and athletic, and we shared a certain intelligence level and a similar education. We were peers and very comfortable with each other. Just before graduation, we were all asked if we would like to volunteer to join the Luftwaffe, which had only recently been formed as a separate branch of the Wehrmacht. I enjoyed the artillery now, had even fallen in love with horses and preferred to stay with it. Since not enough people volunteered, a number of the new graduates were drafted into the Luftwaffe. Among them, much to my chagrin, was Weinreich. I had hoped until then that we would both be assigned to the same unit. Tailor shops were all around the academy in Potsdam, and we all had tailored uniforms made for graduation. We were very proud to be graduating, and we strutted about in our new tailored uniforms. We could wear the officers' insignia on our hats now, but the epaulets on our shoulders were still different. At our graduation ceremony, the commander, his staff, and the students met in an assembly. We heard a few short speeches. Oberst Wetzel made an impassioned speech in which he reminded us that we were part of a proud nation, a proud people, and a proud army. We who were graduating, he said, were a class of destiny, and he expected us to hold our heads high and live up to our country's expectations. I almost shivered with nationalism at his words. Wilhelm Wetzel, link to image, Center, in 1937, as Oberst and Kommandeur of the Kriegsschule in Potsdam. He is flanked by then Oberstleutnant Johannes Friesner and Oberstleutnant Erwin Rommel, commanders of the school's Lehrgruppen A and B, respectively. The ceremony was over in an hour. Then the platoon celebrated a little. Major Kasnitz was not quite as distant as he had been before, and we talked with Lieutenant Brecker on an almost equal basis. A camaraderie was there now, from both of them, that had been missing before. Oberstleutnant Rommel signed my final school record, on which he wrote, "I agree that Knappe should receive the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's award for outstanding achievement." I graduated from the military academy at Potsdam on July 2, 1938, although I was not commissioned as a lieutenant until September. The academy was a tremendous experience for me, and to have won the Inspector of the Kriegsschule's award was a great honour. Except for those assigned to the Luftwaffe, we all returned to the specialties from which we had come, infantry, artillery, panzer, engineers, or whatever, but we were assigned to different bases where nobody had known us as enlisted men. I got a furlough to go home and arrived in time for my parents' 25th wedding anniversary. I wore the formal dress uniform of an Oberfähnrich, complete with sword, and all were very proud of their splendid young soldier. My new assignment was to the 24th Artillery Regiment. Headquarters for the 24th Artillery Regiment was at Altenburg, about 30 miles from Leipzig. 8 of us reported to the regiment from the various Kriegsschules. The next morning, all 8 of us were introduced to Oberst Hartmann, our regiment commander. I knew him by reputation, since I had served under him at Jena, although quite remotely. He was known throughout the 24th Artillery Regiment as the Ice Grey One, because of his grey hair and stern manner. After Hartmann's welcoming speech, we were given our assignments. The 1st Battalion was at Plauen, the 2nd Battalion was at Altenburg, and the 3rd Battalion was at Jena. I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, at Plauen, an industrial city with a population of about 90,000. I had been to Plauen before, but I had never been to the army garrison there. I arrived early so I could familiarise myself with the facilities. The layout was very similar to that of the Jena garrison. The battalion administration building faced the main gate. Extending in a line behind it were 3 barracks buildings, each housing 1 battery. The 3 barracks faced a cobblestone assembly area. A huge training area lay behind the barracks. Behind the training area were two very long and narrow horse stables, and beyond the stables were indoor and outdoor riding arenas. I was greeted by Lieutenant Gerald Niebergall, the battalion adjutant, who told me that I was assigned to 1st Battery, commanded by Hauptmann Dernberg. Hauptmann Kurt Dernberg welcomed me to 1st Battery. "Actually, you are arriving just in time to go on manoeuvres," he said. "You will be our new observation officer, but you will hardly have time to get to know your people before we leave. I will introduce you to our battery officer, Lieutenant Witzleben, at dinner. You and he will need to get to know each other well. You will be working very closely together while we are on manoeuvres, as well as in training new recruits when we return from manoeuvres." Lieutenant Erich Witzleben was about 23 years old, had short blonde hair, a quick smile and an easygoing look about him, and had been in the battery 2 years. "Glad to have you with us," he said when we were introduced. "You will like it here, especially when we get back from manoeuvres. It is a good life." I moved my gear into an officer's apartment in 1st Battery's barracks. The apartment was simple but nicely furnished. I had a bedroom, a small kitchen and a sitting room. Dernberg was married and lived off post. The unmarried lieutenants from the other 2 artillery batteries also had apartments in the barracks. We went on manoeuvres 3 days after I reported to 1st Battery. I was up at 5 o'clock to check out the battery troop and make certain everything was in order. The early morning darkness still held sway at that hour, but the soldiers were stirring. The cook had already been up an hour, had built fires under the kettles on his field kitchen, and had made coffee and tea. The satisfying taste of a cup of hot tea, coupled with the smell of the horses and the clanking of the chains as the horses were being harnessed and hooked up to the carts, guns and wagons, slowly ushered in the light of day. I checked out the equipment of my radio and telephone operators and their horses, as well as the rest of the battery troop. At 7 o'clock, we received the order to pull out and begin the journey to Grafenwehr, where the manoeuvres would be held. It was going to be an all-day march. The 18th Infantry Regiment marched on foot, followed by the 1st Artillery Battalion. Our battery had 4 105 mm guns and all the ammunition and equipment that went with them. Horse-drawn carts also carried supplies, the field kitchens, hay and oats for the horses, and food for the people. We had a blacksmith with his wagon and field forge to replace lost horseshoes and repair equipment. 3 or 4 enlisted men looked after the health of the horses. They were like medical corpsmen for horses. On the way to our destination, we moved on roads. On an uphill grade, the men on the guns, carts and wagons got off and walked in order to make it easier for the horses. Once every hour we stopped for 10 minutes to rest the horses and the marching infantry. At noon, we stopped for an hour to water the horses and feed the men. Each artillery battery and infantry company had its own field kitchen, on which a huge kettle over a fire was used to cook stew as we marched. We stopped again to water the horses and feed the men at about 5 o'clock. We then continued to march, reaching our destination just before dark. We had to position the guns and other equipment, unhook the horses, remove their harness, rub them down, and feed and water them. Then tents had to be erected. It was midnight before we could finally turn in. It had been a very long day, and many men with aching muscles lay down to sleep in the tents that night. Manoeuvres involved 2 divisions, one designated Red Division and the other Blue Division. The 2 divisions were to oppose each other in mock combat. Each division had 3 infantry regiments, and each regiment had 3 battalions of infantry supported by 1 battalion of artillery. The division commander, a general major, would normally keep 1 regiment in reserve, use 1 to feint and try to draw the enemy out of position, and use the remaining regiment to conduct the attack. All the artillery, of course, would be assigned to the infantry regiment making the real attack. We did everything on manoeuvres that we were later to do in combat, even to the extent of building pontoon bridges across the rivers. Umpires judged the battle. They decided which units had been put out of action, how extensive the damage was, and which units were victorious. As much as possible on manoeuvres, officers were housed in local homes in the villages. Families would volunteer guest rooms and be paid for them. If we stayed very long at one place and a restaurant was nearby, we would provide the restaurant with food and pay its staff to prepare and serve it for us for our main meal each day. The soldiers would stay in barns, schools, churches, or whatever larger facilities were available. If nothing else was available, they would stay in tents. If no villages were in the vicinity, officers would live in tents and eat from the field kitchen with the soldiers. Once at the area of manoeuvres, we moved cross-country, just as we would in combat, and the farmers were compensated for any damage to their fences or land. I got to know Dernberg and Witzleben better during manoeuvres because we all had to rely on each other so much. Dernberg, as battery commander, had to approve my selection of my forward observation post and Witzleben's selection of his gun positions. If he did not approve, he would explain why and make the necessary changes. Going to training camps such as Grafenwehr on manoeuvres was good for us because it was the only time we could use live artillery ammunition. Going through the motions of firing the guns in the training area at Plauen was fine, but eventually the men needed to know the exhilaration of firing live ammunition and living under field conditions. Of course, we had to be very careful that no enemy troops were really in the vicinity where the rounds would fall. Manoeuvres lasted a week, and then it was time to return to Plauen. Following manoeuvres, I found that life at Plauen was very pleasant. My bachelor apartment in the barrack was quite comfortable, and I had an orderly who kept it clean and did a little cooking if I had a guest. We worked 10 to 12 hours each day during the week. On Saturday we worked until noon, and then were free until Monday morning unless we had officer of the day duties, which consisted of supervising the guards and in general looking after things. We had such duties about every fourth weekend, and on the other weekends we were free to do as we pleased. I was only about 100 kilometres from home and went home occasionally, but for the most part I found it more interesting to stay in Plauen. Soon after we returned from manoeuvres, Witzleben offered to show me the town. We put on civilian clothing, got into Witzleben's car, and toured Plauen during the afternoon. As always in a new place, I wanted to see the historical places, cathedrals, and interesting architecture. Witzleben was an excellent tour guide, since he'd had 2 years to find all the out-of-the-way places of Plauen. We crisscrossed the whole city, stopping whenever we saw a remarkable building or anything else that caught our attention. Around 5 o'clock, Witzleben announced that he was going to show me his favourite afternoon café. It was common for cafés to play dance music on gramophones in the afternoon, or even to have 2 or 3 musicians playing live dance music. Young men and women would go to the cafés as a way of meeting each other. If a boy saw a girl he wanted to meet, he asked her to dance. Then, if he liked her, he would ask her to join him at his table. The cafés served tea, coffee, beer, wine, and some food. Witzleben drove to the café and parked the car near it. When we went inside, a 3-piece combo was playing dance music. Witzleben immediately saw a girl he knew and led us to her table. "Bettina, it's nice to see you again," he said to a tall, attractive brunette who smiled prettily at him with dancing green eyes. "Hello, Eric," she said. "Permit me to introduce my friend Gisela." Her friend was small, with short blonde hair, blue eyes, and a quick smile. Witzleben introduced me, and the girls invited us to join them. I found Gisela to be very attractive. I danced with her and learned that she was also witty and fun to be with. She was very outgoing, with a bubbly personality. Bettina was more reserved, although both obviously liked having a good time. We enjoyed their company and had a very pleasant evening. On September 1st, 1938, I was ordered to report to our battalion commander, Major Court. I felt sure my commission as a lieutenant had finally been approved. I reported as ordered and found the battalion's other 2 Oberfahndrichs there as well. Major Court smiled and congratulated us on being promoted to lieutenant. We had been functioning as commissioned officers all along, so all it really meant was that our shoulder epaulettes changed from those of Oberfahndrich to those of lieutenant. It was nonetheless cause for celebration, and Niebergall, Witzleben and I celebrated late into the night in the officers' mess, along with the other new lieutenants and their friends. There were many social events in Plauen we attended. Plauen was an industrial town with a large upper class that had private clubs where we were always welcome. We were not members of these civilian social clubs because we could not afford to be, but many of the wealthy families had daughters and were glad to have young officers to escort them. For most events in Plauen, we in the officer corps had a standing invitation to attend. A notice would be placed on the battalion's bulletin board, letting us know of coming events. We were part of the social life of the city. Army officers were considered part of the social elite because of a long tradition of the nobility being army officers. Those of us who were not part of the nobility were accepted by association and long tradition. Because of this, we felt a special responsibility when we were in uniform. As soon as we put our uniforms on, we adopted impeccable etiquette. If we wanted to relax, we wore civilian clothing. If it was an official event, or if the battalion commander was to be there, we always wore uniforms. I attended my first social event in late September. Witzleben and I picked up Gisela and Bettina in his car and drove to the dance. Because it was a formal affair at one of the private clubs, and because Hauptmann Dörnberg and Major Kort were going to be there, we wore our dress uniforms. The private club was on the outskirts of Plauen, a few miles away from the post, in a massive ivy-covered brick building. Large pillars with rounded pots on top supported kerosene-fueled lanterns that lit the walkway. As we entered the club, we could hear an orchestra playing. Inside, Witzleben pointed out Hauptmann Dörnberg and Major Kort. They were seated at a large round table and invited us to join them. During the evening I danced with both Frau Dörnberg and Frau Kort. Frau Dörnberg was very proper and said very little. Frau Kort was outgoing and talkative. At one point as we were dancing, she broke into a few steps of the Lambeth Walk, an English dance that was very popular with young people but had been forbidden by the government as degenerate. I was startled at her indiscretion, but she smiled impishly and winked. She apparently enjoyed startling a young officer with her naughtiness. Like young people everywhere, we liked music and we liked to dance. In addition to the Lambeth Walk, some music was also forbidden by the government as degenerate, especially American and British pop music. We could not do the forbidden dances or play the forbidden music in public dance halls, but at the private clubs we would wait for the battalion commander to leave, and then we would do as we liked. There was always a live band, and they always knew the music. I took Gisela to many of the social events in Plauen. As an attractive, fun-loving 18-year-old blonde and the daughter of a wealthy manufacturer, Gisela was very appealing to young officers, and I had a lot of competition for her attention. She and I rode our horses together on weekends and went to riding tournaments together. We also went to theatres and concerts. It was a very happy and carefree time. My army pay was enough to maintain a fairly good standard of living. A lieutenant was paid 300 Reichsmarks, about 70 Wals per month, an Oberleutnant 400 Reichsmarks, about 95, a Hauptmann 500 Reichsmarks, about 119, and a Major 600 Reichsmarks, about 142. Our room and board were also provided. On our pay we could afford to have an inexpensive car and a horse. I was learning that being an officer in the peacetime German army was a very nice life. The new class of recruits arrived in October. Last year's class received promotions to Oberkanonier or Gefreiter, and they would now help train the new class of recruits under 1st Battery's 2 senior Wachtmeisters, Schmundt and Ritter, and their subordinate Unteroffiziers, Obergefreiters and Stabsgefreiters. The soldiers who had completed their 2 years in the army and did not choose to remain in the army for a career were discharged to go home. Lieutenant Witzleben and I divided the responsibility for training the recruits between us. I had the responsibility for Fahrer training, and Witzleben had the responsibility for Kanonier training. Witzleben and I did most of the classroom lectures, and the non-commissioned officers performed the field training. I would go from one training group to the next during the day, either on horseback or on foot, and observe the training being performed by the non-commissioned officers. I would normally just observe, although occasionally, if called upon, I would participate. Once, as I was observing a group on the pistol firing range, the Gefreiter conducting the training invited me to demonstrate for the trainees. I took a pistol and placed 3 rapid shots into the bull's eye. Although I was a good marksman, this was pure luck. Nevertheless, the trainees and the Gefreiter were enormously impressed. Naturally, I did not confess that it was just a stroke of luck. Each artillery officer had 2 horses and an enlisted man called a Förderhalter to care for them. In manoeuvres or combat, the officer rode one of the horses and the Förderhalter rode the other. When the officer dismounted in a combat situation, the Förderhalter took both horses to cover in a woods or valley or creek, where they were protected and could not be seen. If the stop was for a day or 2, he found shelter for the horses. Every year, some officers and the veterinarian from each battalion went to horse auctions to buy horses. These were all experienced people who knew horses very well. The horses would be 3 to 4 years old. Each battalion had its own budget, and if we needed 10 riding horses and 12 draft horses, we would try to get the best we could for the money we had to spend. The horses would be completely untrained, and the army would then train them. We had Unterwachtmeisters who did that constantly under the direction of a lieutenant or a Wachtmeister. Officers spent a small part of their time training their own horses. We could buy our own horses, train them, and then sell them for a profit. Most artillery and cavalry officers did that each year. We could buy an untrained horse for about 1,500 Reichsmarks and sell a well-trained horse for 4,000. It provided a nice extra income. We had the fun and gained the experience of training the horses, and the army was happy with the arrangement as well. We did the training as part of our regular duties. I did not really know enough to buy my own horse at this time, so I had a Hauptmann who was an expert at judging horses buy one for me near Hanover. I just had to buy the horse and the saddle. The government would pay for its upkeep, and I would have a soldier to take care of it. When my horse was led from the van, I was impressed. He was a 4-year-old chestnut gelding named Swabian Prince. Frightened from the strange experience of the train ride, he came off the van sweaty, wide-eyed, and snorting loudly. I talked to him in soothing tones and rubbed his neck and shoulders and calmed him somewhat. I stayed with him in his stall for some time, just talking to him and petting him. During the training period, I visited him every day, talked to him, brushed him, and led him a little. I worked him on the line, teaching him the basics, but I also added some small 1-foot jumps. I wanted a well-schooled jumper, so I began the process early. Then several of us who were training our own horses would take them together into the riding arena so they would get used to other horses. When the time finally came for me to mount him, he accepted my weight without resistance, even though he was obviously very nervous about the new experience. He knew me well, and I had taken ample time to prepare him for this moment. Then I began a program of an hour of riding every day. Then came the occupation of the Sudetenland, a part of pre-World War Germany that had been given to Czechoslovakia by the Versailles Treaty, and that was still heavily populated by ethnic Germans. As early as May, while I was still at Kriegsschule Potsdam, the newspapers had been full of stories about the abuse of the ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland by the Czechoslovakian government. The stories had continued through the summer and become increasingly worse. We did not know, of course, that much of it was the creation of Goebbels's propaganda machine. The only news we received was from the controlled press, and it never occurred to us to question it. At the Nuremberg rally in 1938, Hitler had threatened to see to it that the Czechs gave justice to the Sudeten Germans. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had been negotiating with Hitler since mid-September. In a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast, Hitler had announced that he would have the Sudetenland by October 1st, even if he had to take it militarily. We received orders to be prepared to march and were moved up to the Czech border on September 26th. I recalled Herr Hofer's gloomy predictions of war barely 30 months earlier, as we now prepared to invade the Sudeten area near where I had met him. I had seen some of the Czech fortifications on skiing trips in the Ore Mountains. Plauen was only 35 kilometres from the Czechoslovakian border, and the best skiing area was just across the border. Then, on September 29th, Hitler and Prime Minister Chamberlain met again, along with Daladier of France and Mussolini of Italy. On September 30th, the announcement was made that Czechoslovakia had accepted our peaceful occupation of the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. The occupation was to begin October 1st and be completed by October 10th. We all felt that we had righted a wrong that had been done to us by the Versailles Treaty. We were ordered to be ready to pull out at 7 a.m. on October 1st. I was up at 5 to see that everything was done properly and went smoothly. The cook's hot tea was a real bracer against the early morning chill at this time of year. The horses were fed and watered, and then the men were fed. The big difference between this operation and manoeuvres was that this time the men were issued live ammunition for their rifles. We did not expect resistance, but the issue of live ammunition had a sobering effect on everyone. All the units were lined up, and precisely at 7 Sass we pulled out. We followed the roads instead of going cross-country, which means that we went south first and then turned east into Czechoslovakia. Although we did not expect resistance, we had full equipment, were well trained, and could have gone into battle if necessary. As it turned out, the Sudeten Germans we encountered all greeted us enthusiastically, and we did not encounter any Czech army units. They had apparently withdrawn from the Sudetenland prior to October 4. I felt comfortable in the Sudetenland because I had skied here so many times. We went into Czechoslovakia only 35 to 70 kilometres all along the border. On October 5th, 1938, we went into quarters in a village near Carlsbad, Czechoslovakia. Everything was quiet and all the news was good. I was quartered with several other officers, including Niebergall, Dernberg and Witzleben. The 4 of us met at a village restaurant for our noon meal. "Everything has gone perfectly so far," Dernberg said with obvious satisfaction. "This is a good demonstration of the value of constant training. It has been just like a manoeuvre." "I think we should celebrate our victory," Witzleben suggested, always ready for a party. "So far, not a single casualty." "Good idea," agreed Niebergall with a smile. "I nominate Knappe to find some champagne or good wine for the celebration, since the rest of us outrank him." "I guess that is the price you must pay for being youngest, Knappe," Dernberg said. After lunch, I tried to find wine in the village and discovered that none was available. The village was too small, and I would have to go to a larger town to get champagne or wine. I decided to take a motorcycle and go to the next town, which was about a 30-minute ride. I put some saddlebags onto a motorcycle, started the motor, and headed down a gravel road toward the next town. The next thing I was aware of was being in a hospital room. I could not imagine where I was until a nurse came into the room and I asked her. I learned that I was in a military hospital at Grafenwehr, back in Germany. I learned only later what had apparently happened. All that was known was that the battalion veterinarian later that day went down that same road and found me lying near a culvert, unconscious, with the motorcycle nearby. He returned and sent an ambulance for me. It took me to the military hospital at Grafenwehr, about 90 kilometres northeast of Nuremberg. The nurse told me I had been unconscious for 36 hours. The last thing I remembered was leaving on the motorcycle. It was a gravel road, and I must have lost control of the motorcycle on the loose gravel. A cement milestone was on the road near where they found me, and I must have hit my head on that. Fortunately, I was wearing my steel helmet, or I would probably have been killed. I had no broken bones, no cuts, and just a few bruises. I did not even have a headache. I found it hard to believe that the incident had even occurred. I had felt worse after my first full day in the saddle. The doctor refused to let me return to my unit because I had had a concussion, and as standard procedure, I had to lie flat for 3 weeks. Then I was allowed to return to Plauen, but not to active duty. I went to Leipzig for several days of convalescent leave near the end of October, once I was permitted to travel. My brother, Fritz, seemed to be almost disappointed that we had not had to fight our way into the Sudetenland. "Didn't you see any Czech soldiers?" he asked incredulously. "None," I assured him. "If I had not rammed my head into that milestone, there probably would not have been any violence at all." Our regiment returned to Plauen around November 1st and held a victory parade. By then I was out of the hospital and back in my barracks apartment, but I was still convalescing and had to watch the parade from my apartment window. I took some ribbing from Witzleben and others about that. Just after my return to duty, Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, occurred. A young German Jew whose family had been sent to concentration camps had walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot to death a minor German official. In retribution, the Nazi brownshirts during the night of November 9th rampaged across Germany, burning synagogues and destroying stores, buildings and apartments belonging to Jews. In a few places, Jews were killed when they tried to resist, and many were wounded. The event was called Crystal Night because of the broken windows.